The day started like any other. I kissed Sarah goodbye as she headed out for a girls' day, brewed my morning coffee, and settled into my home office. But as I reached for my phone to check my email, a notification caught my eye. A message preview from Sarah's tablet, synced to our shared cloud account. Can't stop thinking about last night. You're amazing. The words burned into my brain. My stomach churned as I stared at the screen, my mind racing to make sense of what I'd just read. It had to be a mistake. Sarah wasn't the type. We'd been married for 8 years, built a life together, and shared countless memories. But curiosity and dread propelled me forward. I opened the messaging app, synced to the account, my heart pounding as I scrolled through the thread. The messages were explicit, intimate, and far beyond the boundaries of casual conversation. I can't wait until we're together again. I'll book the hotel this time. Somewhere special. The sender was listed as Marcus. I didn't recognize the name, but it didn't matter. Whoever he wasn't me. By the time Sarah came home that evening, I was barely holding it together. She walked into the kitchen, her smile fading when she saw my expression. What's wrong? I held up her tablet, the messages open on the screen. Care to explain this? Her face went pale, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Jason, it's not what you think, she stammered. Then tell me what it is, I said, my voice sharp. She hesitated, then sighed, her shoulders slumping. It's just harmless flirting, she said. I met him online. It doesn't mean anything. Her words felt like a slap. Harmless, I said, incredulous. You're sexting another man and booking hotel rooms, and you think that's harmless? It's just an escape, she said, tears welling in her eyes. We've been so distant lately, and I guess I just needed attention. Her admission sent a wave of anger crashing over me, but I forced myself to stay calm. Who is he? I demanded. Her gaze darted away. Just a stranger. Someone I met on a forum. I swear, Jason, it's not serious. But I didn't believe her, and I was determined to find out the truth. Sarah's words echoed in my mind long after she went to bed that night. It's not serious. Just a stranger. But the messages I'd read told a different story. They weren't just flirty exchanges or idle fantasies. They were intimate, calculated, and filled with promises of meetings that had already happened. I lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, the knot in my stomach tightening with every passing second. The next morning, I waited until Sarah left for work before diving back into the tablet. The conversation with Marcus was still open, the words staring back at me like a taunt. I scrolled further, piecing together the timeline of their interactions. Their chats went back months, longer than I'd expected. One message stood out. Marcus, you always knew where you belonged. Don't let anything hold you back this time. I read it over and over, the words digging into me like claws. This time, the phrase sent a chill through me. It wasn't just a fling. There was history here. I copied the messages to a secure folder on my laptop, my fingers trembling as I saved the screenshots. This wasn't just about catching Sarah in a lie. It was about uncovering the truth. And I had a sinking feeling I wouldn't like what I found. That evening, I tried to act normal. Sarah came home, kissed me on the cheek, and started dinner like nothing was wrong. How was your day? She asked, glancing at me over her shoulder. Busy, I said, forcing a smile. Yours? She hesitated for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Good. Just the usual. Her words were casual, but her body language betrayed her. She was tense, her movements slightly off, as if she knew I was watching her. After dinner, I made an excuse to stay up late in my office. Sarah kissed me goodnight and went to bed, leaving her phone charging on the counter. When I was sure she was asleep, I unlocked it. The first thing I noticed was that her conversation with Marcus wasn't on the phone. Either she'd deleted it, or it was confined to the tablet. But there were other clues, emails with vague subject lines, a calendar notification for an upcoming work trip, and photos in a hidden folder that made my stomach turn. They weren't explicit, but they didn't need to be. A selfie of her at a hotel, another of a coffee cup on a table for two. As I stared at the images, my mind raced. Who was Marcus? Where had she met him? And how far had this gone? I needed answers, and I wasn't going to get them from Sarah. It was time to do some digging of my own. The next morning, Sarah left for work as usual, her phone in her purse and her smile faintly strained. Have a good day, she said, leaning in for a quick kiss. I returned it but didn't reply, watching as she walked out the door. Once her car disappeared down the street, I sprang into action. Her tablet was still sitting on the counter, its screen locked. But I didn't need it. I'd already backed up the messages onto my laptop. Instead, I opened her laptop, hoping to find something she hadn't hidden. At first, everything looked innocent. Work emails, a few unopened promotional offers, and an unremarkable browsing history. But as I dug deeper, I found a folder buried in her documents, labeled simply personal. Inside were old photos, high school prom, group shots with friends, and a few of her as a teenager with a boy I didn't recognize. They were close in every photo, their arms draped around each other, their smiles wide and carefree. In one image, they were standing in front of a banner that read Homecoming 2006. The boy looked familiar, but I couldn't place him. I flipped through the photos, my stomach sinking as a pattern emerged. This wasn't just a friend. The pieces clicked into place when I found a scanned yearbook page with his name circled in red ink, Marcus Wells. My chest tightened. This wasn't a stranger. This was her high school sweetheart. I sat back in the chair, my mind racing. Why hadn't she told me it was him? Why lie and say it was someone she met online? And what was he doing back in her life now? That evening, when Sarah came home, I couldn't look at her the same way. "Hey," she said, setting her purse down. "What's for dinner?" "I was thinking takeout," I said, forcing a smile. "Sounds good," she replied, her voice cheerful. She moved around the kitchen with the ease of someone who thought everything was fine, completely unaware of what I'd uncovered. After dinner, I sat on the couch, pretending to scroll through my phone while Sarah watched TV. My mind was elsewhere, spinning with questions I couldn't ask her. Not yet. I needed more information, and I needed it fast. The next day, I called an old friend, Kevin, who worked in cybersecurity. "Jason," he said, his tone bright. "It's been a while. What's up?" "I need your help," I said, my voice low. "And it's delicate." Kevin didn't press for details, but he agreed to help. By the time we hung up, he had access to Sarah's devices, tracking her messages and location in real time. That evening, as I watched Sarah from across the dinner table, a notification buzzed on my phone. It was from Kevin. "Kevin, she's meeting someone tomorrow night. I'll send the details." My pulse quickened. The trap was set. When Kevin sent the details of Sarah's planned rendezvous, my heart sank. It wasn't at a hotel or some random coffee shop. It was at a park. Our park. The one where we'd had our first picnic, where I proposed to her under the willow tree. The place that was supposed to belong to us. I stared at the message, my mind racing with a mix of anger and disbelief. Was this intentional? A cruel jab at me? Or just a convenient location that happened to be steeped in meaning? Either way, I wasn't going to let it slide. "Jason, are you listening?" I looked up from my phone to find Sarah watching me, her brow furrowed. "Sorry," I said, forcing a smile. "Long day at work." She studied me for a moment, then nodded, seemingly satisfied with the excuse. But I knew she was hiding something, just as I was. That night, after Sarah went to bed, I called Kevin. "Tell me everything you've got," I said, pacing the living room. "She's meeting him at 8 p.m., Kevin said. "The messages are still vague. Lots of can't wait to see you, and it's been too long, but it's clear this isn't their first time meeting." "And Marcus?" I asked. "What do you know about him?" "I ran a basic search," Kevin replied. "He's recently moved back to town after years out west. Divorced, no kids. Looks like he and Sarah reconnected on social media." The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they painted was one I didn't want to see. "I need a favor," I said after a moment. "Name it," Kevin replied. "Can you give me access to their live chat during the meeting? I want to see exactly what's happening in real time." Kevin hesitated. "That's invasive, Jason. Are you sure you want to go that far?" "I don't have a choice," I said firmly. Kevin sighed, but agreed. "All right, I'll set it up, but be careful, okay? This could get messy." The next day passed in a haze. Sarah went about her usual routine, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface. She left for her workout class at 7 p.m., kissing me on the cheek before walking out the door. "Don't wait up," she said with a smile. I watched her go, my chest tightening with a mix of anger and heartbreak. She didn't even bother to hide it. By 7:45, I was parked a safe distance from the park, my phone buzzing with notifications from Kevin. "Kevin, she's there. So is he." "Kevin, I've activated the audio feed. Check your app." My hands shook as I opened the app, the faint sound of voices crackling through the speakers. "Marcus," Sarah's voice said, warm and familiar. "It's so good to see you." "You too," Marcus replied. "You look amazing." I clenched my fists, the words cutting deeper than I expected. Their conversation was casual at first, filled with small talk and laughter. But as the minutes passed, the tone shifted. "You know this can't go on forever," Marcus said. "We have to make a decision." "I know," Sarah replied, her voice softer now. I'm scared, Marcus. What if it doesn't work out?" "It will," he said firmly. "It's meant to. You and me, we were always supposed to be together." My grip on the phone tightened as I listened, my anger bubbling over. They weren't just meeting for old time's sake. They were planning a future, one that didn't include me. But I wasn't going to let that happen. Listening to Sarah and Marcus talk about their future together was like being stabbed with a dull blade, slow and excruciating. Every laugh, every whispered word of affection felt like another twist. But even through the pain, my resolve solidified. I wasn't just going to confront them. I was going to make sure they couldn't weasel their way out of it. By the time their conversation ended and Sarah walked back to her car, I had already started planning. I needed proof. Undeniable, irrefutable evidence. Something that would force Sarah to admit the truth. And I knew exactly how to get it. The next morning, while Sarah was at work, I called Kevin again. "I need one more favor," I said. Kevin sighed. "Jason, this is getting out of hand. Are you sure this is the road you want to go down?" "I don't have a choice," I said firmly. "I need cameras, hidden ones. Can you help me set them up?" Kevin was quiet for a moment. "Where are you planning to put them?" "At the park," I said. "They're meeting again in 2 days, same place. I want it all on video." Kevin reluctantly agreed, and by that evening, the plan was in motion. We installed the cameras under the cover of darkness, positioning them near the bench where Sarah and Marcus had met. The angles were perfect, capturing both their faces and any movement nearby. "Once this is done," Kevin said as we finished setting up, "you're going to have to decide what to do with it." "Are you ready for that?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But I can't keep living like this." The next 2 days were agony. Sarah continued her charade, smiling and laughing as if nothing was wrong, while I counted down the hours until her next meeting. When the evening finally arrived, she left the house with the same excuse as before. "I won't be late," she said, kissing me on the cheek. I nodded, barely able to look at her. This time, I didn't follow her. I sat in my office, staring at my laptop as the live feed from the cameras came online. It didn't take long for them to appear. Sarah and Marcus walked hand in hand to the bench, their faces lit with smiles. My stomach churned as I watched them sit, their bodies angled toward each other in a way that screamed intimacy. "Have you thought about what we talked about?" Marcus asked, his voice clear through the audio feed. Sarah nodded, her expression conflicted. "I have. And I think you're right. We can't keep doing this." My breath caught. Was she ending it? But then Marcus reached for her hand, his grip firm. "So when?" he asked. She hesitated, then sighed. "Next weekend. I'll tell Jason I'm going on a business trip, and we'll leave that night." The world tilted around me. They weren't just meeting. They weren't just flirting. They were planning to run away together. I closed the laptop, my mind racing. They thought they'd won, thought they could just erase me from their lives. But they were wrong. Next weekend, I wasn't going to let them slip away unnoticed. I was going to be there, waiting. The realization that Sarah and Marcus were planning to leave together lit a fire in me. For days, I'd been grappling with anger and disbelief, unsure of how to respond. But now I knew. This wasn't going to end with them running away while I sat at home, blindsided and humiliated. I was going to confront them, and I was going to make sure they felt the weight of their betrayal. The first step was gathering everything I needed, the videos, the messages, and the timestamps. I spent the next morning compiling the evidence into a single folder on my laptop. Every screenshot, every recording, every detail. They were all there, laid out like a map of their deceit. When I was done, I called Kevin. "It's happening this weekend," I said, my voice tight. "They're planning to leave Saturday night." Kevin sighed. "And what's your plan?" "I'm going to catch them in the act," I said firmly. "And then what?" he asked. "Are you going to confront them? Expose them?" "Jason, you need to think this through." "I've already thought it through," I said, my grip on the phone tightening. "They've been lying to me for months. They don't get to walk away without consequences." The rest of the week was excruciating. Sarah continued her usual routine, completely unaware of what was coming. She packed a small suitcase on Friday evening, telling me it was for a work conference. "I'll be back Sunday night," she said, her smile almost convincing. I nodded, forcing a neutral expression. "Have a safe trip." On Saturday, I arrived at the park hours before their planned meeting, positioning myself in a hidden spot near the bench. I wasn't just going to rely on the cameras this time. I needed to be there to see it with my own eyes. As the evening wore on, the park grew quieter, the fading light casting long shadows across the ground. At exactly 8 p.m., Sarah arrived. She was dressed casually, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail, but there was an air of nervous excitement about her. Marcus showed up minutes later, his grin wide as he approached her. They sat on the bench, their voices low but clear enough for me to hear. "Are you ready?" Marcus asked, his hand brushing hers. Sarah hesitated, glancing around the park before nodding. "I think so. I told Jason I'll be gone until Sunday night. He won't suspect anything." Her words stung, but I stayed silent, waiting for the right moment. Marcus leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I have the tickets. We'll leave tonight, just like we planned. By the time he realizes what's happening, we'll be halfway across the country." That was it. I stepped out of the shadows, my heart pounding. "Going somewhere?" I said, my voice cold and steady. Their heads snapped toward me, their expressions a mix of shock and panic. "Jason," Sarah stammered, standing abruptly. "What are you doing here?" "Catching you in the act," I said, holding up my phone, which was still recording. Marcus stood too, his face hardening. "This isn't what it looks like," he said quickly. I laughed bitterly. "Really?" "Because it looks like you two were about to skip town together." Sarah's face crumpled, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Jason, please let me explain." "Explain what?" I snapped, cutting her off. "That you've been lying to me for months? That you've been sneaking around with him behind my back?" I turned to Marcus, my voice dripping with venom. "And you? Did you think you could just waltz back into her life and take what's mine?" Marcus glared at me, his jaw tightening. "You weren't giving her what she needed. Don't act like this is all on her." The audacity of his words made my blood boil. "I've got everything," I said, holding up my phone. "The messages, the videos, all of it. You thought you could get away with this, but you were wrong." Sarah collapsed back onto the bench, her sobs racking her body. "Jason, I'm sorry," she choked out. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." I stared at her, my anger warring with the love I'd once felt. "You didn't mean for it to go this far?" I repeated, my voice low. "You were going to leave me. How do you come back from that?" She had no answer. Marcus took a step forward, his posture defiant. "She deserves better than you," he said. "And you think that's you?" I shot back. "You're nothing but a coward sneaking around like this." He didn't reply, his face darkening as he realized he had no defense. I turned to Sarah one last time, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. "You made your choice," I said. "Now, you'll have to live with the consequences." And with that, I walked away, leaving them both to face the fallout. Walking away from the park wasn't as satisfying as I thought it would be. My anger still burned hot, but beneath it, a hollow ache spread through my chest. I'd spent years building a life with Sarah, trusting her, loving her, and now it felt like it had all been for nothing. As I drove home, the silence in the car was suffocating. My mind replayed the confrontation over and over, each word stabbing like a blade. When I got home, I sat at the dining table, staring at my phone. The videos, the messages, the evidence, it was all there, proof of their betrayal. But what now? Did I send it to our friends and family, exposing Sarah and Marcus for what they were? Did I use it to file for divorce, wiping my hands clean of the whole mess? Or did I give Sarah the chance to explain herself, even if I wasn't sure I wanted to hear it? The decision weighed on me all night. I barely slept, my thoughts spinning in a relentless loop. When the sun finally rose, it brought no clarity, only exhaustion. At 9 a.m., Sarah's car pulled into the driveway. I watched from the window as she sat in the driver's seat, her hands gripping the steering wheel. She didn't move for a long time. Finally, she stepped out, her shoulders slumped, and walked to the front door. When she entered the house, her eyes were red and swollen, her face pale. "Jason," she said softly, her voice trembling. I didn't respond, just stared at her. She stood there for a moment, then sank into the chair across from me, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I don't even know where to start," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "How about the beginning?" I said coldly. "When did this start, Sarah? How long have you been lying to me?" Her tears spilled over, but I didn't flinch. 6 months, she admitted. We reconnected online, and at first it was just messages, catching up, talking about old times. But then it became something more. I leaned back in my chair, the weight of her words pressing down on me. "And you didn't think to stop? To tell me?" "I didn't know how," she said, her voice breaking. "I was scared. I felt lost. And when Marcus showed up, it was like I could escape everything." "Escape what?" I snapped. "Me? Our marriage? The life we built together?" Her silence was answer enough. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Finally, I broke the silence. "Do you love him?" I asked, my voice quiet but firm. Her head shot up, her eyes wide. "No," she said quickly. "I thought I did, but now I see it for what it was, a fantasy, a way to avoid dealing with the cracks in our marriage." "And what about me?" I asked, my voice thick with emotion. "Do you love me, Sarah?" Her tears flowed freely now. "Yes," she whispered. "I love you, Jason." I never stopped. Her words hit me harder than I expected, stirring a flicker of something I couldn't quite name. Love? Doubt? Hope? I didn't know, but I wasn't ready to forgive her. "Not yet. I don't know what to do with this," I said finally, gesturing to the phone on the table. "With you. With us. I'll do anything," she said, her voice desperate. "I'll go to therapy. I'll cut all ties with Marcus. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this." Her plea was raw, filled with a vulnerability I hadn't seen in months. But I wasn't sure if it was enough. "Therapy," I said after a long pause. "We'll start there. But don't expect this to fix everything overnight, Sarah. It's going to take time." She nodded, her hands trembling. "I understand, and I'll wait as long as it takes." I stood, the conversation leaving me drained. "I need space," I said, walking toward the door. "I'll let you know when I'm ready to talk again." Her sobs followed me as I left the house, the sound cutting deeper than I wanted to admit. The house felt oppressively quiet after I walked out. Sarah's sobs still echoed in my mind, but I pushed them aside. I drove aimlessly for hours, the weight of her confession pressing down on me like a physical burden. 6 months. 6 months of lies, stolen moments, and betrayal. How had I missed it? How had we gotten so far off track? By the time I returned home, the house was dark. Sarah had gone to bed, but her suitcase was still by the door, a silent reminder of how close she'd come to leaving. I didn't touch it. I didn't want to think about what it represented. Instead, I sat in the living room, staring at the evidence I'd gathered, the messages, the videos, the undeniable proof of what she'd done. And yet a part of me wanted to delete it all. I didn't want this to be my reality. The next morning, Sarah approached me cautiously, her eyes swollen from crying. "I found a therapist," she said quietly, handing me a piece of paper with a name and phone number. "I've already scheduled an appointment for us." Her determination caught me off guard. "You're serious about this?" I said, more a statement than a question. She nodded. "I'll do whatever it takes, Jason." "I mean it." The first therapy session was brutal. The therapist, a middle-aged woman with a calm demeanor, didn't waste time easing us in. "Let's start with the obvious," she said, her voice steady. "Sarah, why did you cheat?" Sarah flinched, her hands twisting in her lap. "I didn't plan for it to happen," she said softly. "I wasn't happy, and instead of talking to Jason, I looked for an escape." I stayed silent. My jaw clenched as her words settled over me. "And Jason," the therapist continued, turning to me, "how does that make you feel?" "Like I wasn't enough," I said bitterly. "Like everything I've done for her and our marriage didn't matter." Sarah started to cry, but I didn't let up. "You had a choice, Sarah," I said, my voice rising. "You could have come to me. We could have worked on this together. But instead, you ran to him." The therapist intervened before the conversation spiraled further. "Jason, your anger is valid," she said. "But if you want to move forward, we need to focus on understanding, not just blame." Understanding. The word felt impossible in that moment, but I nodded anyway. The session ended with an agreement to keep the lines of communication open. Sarah promised to be honest, no matter how difficult the conversations became. And I promised to listen. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Over the next few weeks, we continued therapy, each session peeling back layers of resentment, hurt, and fear. I learned things about Sarah I hadn't known: her insecurities, her doubts about herself, her struggles to balance being a wife, a professional, and her own person. And she learned things about me: the pressure I felt to provide, the loneliness I'd buried under a mountain of work, the way I'd pulled away without even realizing it. It wasn't an excuse for what she'd done, but it was a reason. One night, after the kids were in bed, Sarah and I sat on the couch, a silence hanging between us. "Do you think we'll ever be okay again?" she asked, her voice trembling. I stared at her, the woman I'd loved for years, the woman who'd broken my heart. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I think we're trying." She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to look away. Trying didn't mean forgetting. Every day felt like a test of patience and resolve. Some mornings, I woke up to the sound of Sarah making coffee, and for a fleeting moment, everything felt normal. Other mornings, I remembered the betrayal, and the bitterness returned like an unwelcome guest. But therapy had taught me to sit with the discomfort, to allow myself to feel the anger and pain without letting it consume me. That was easier said than done. One afternoon, as Sarah and I folded laundry together, she spoke up hesitantly. "I've been thinking about cutting ties with social media," she said, her hands working nervously over a pile of shirts. I raised an eyebrow. "Why?" She shrugged, not meeting my gaze. "It's how Marcus and I reconnected. And I just think it's better if I step away for a while." Her suggestion caught me off guard. It was a small gesture, but it felt significant, a step toward regaining my trust. "I think that's a good idea," I said finally. She looked up, relief flickering in her eyes. "You do?" I nodded. "Yeah." Later that evening, as I sat on the porch with a glass of whiskey, I thought about Sarah's decision. She deleted Marcus from her contacts weeks ago and blocked him on every platform we could think of. But the shadow of his presence still lingered in our marriage, an unspoken weight neither of us could fully shake. Cutting ties with social media wouldn't erase the past, but it was another step. And for now, that was enough. The next week, Sarah surprised me by suggesting a weekend getaway. "It doesn't have to be fancy," she said, her tone careful. "Just a chance for us to reconnect." I hesitated. The idea of spending uninterrupted time with her, away from the distractions of daily life, was daunting. But I also knew it might help us move forward. "Okay," I said finally. Her smile was small but genuine. We booked a cabin a few hours away, nestled in the woods near a quiet lake. The kids stayed with Sarah's sister, giving us 2 days to focus solely on each other. At first, the silence was awkward. We unpacked in near total quiet, each of us unsure how to navigate the unfamiliar territory of rebuilding. But as the hours passed, the tension began to ease. That evening, we sat by the fire, the warmth of the flames softening the edges of the conversation. "Do you ever think about how we met?" Sarah asked suddenly, her voice wistful. I smiled faintly, nodding. "You mean when you spilled coffee on me during our first class?" Her laughter was soft, but genuine. I was so embarrassed. "I thought you'd never talk to me again." "I thought it was adorable," I admitted. "You were the only person who made college feel less intimidating." Her eyes shimmered with tears, and she reached for my hand. "I miss that version of us." Her words hit me harder than I expected. "I miss it too," I said after a moment. "But that doesn't mean we can't find something new." She squeezed my hand, her voice trembling. "I want that, Jason, more than anything." That night, as we lay in the dark, I realized something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The weekend at the cabin was the closest Sarah and I had felt in months. Waking up to the sound of bird song and the smell of pine trees was grounding. It gave us a sense of simplicity we hadn't experienced in years. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking about Marcus or the betrayal. I was thinking about us. The second day, we rented a small rowboat to explore the lake. Sarah sat across from me, her face serene as she trailed her fingers in the water. "I forgot how peaceful this can be," she said, her voice soft. "Yeah," I replied, glancing around at the stillness of the lake. It felt like a metaphor for where we were, a surface that seemed calm, but with ripples beneath it waiting to resurface. We paddled to a small, secluded cove and sat in silence for a while, the boat rocking gently beneath us. I want to say something, Sarah said suddenly, breaking the quiet. I stopped rowing and looked at her. Okay. She took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I know I've apologized before, but I don't think I've fully explained how sorry I am. What I did, it was selfish, and it hurt you in ways I can't even imagine. Her voice trembled as she continued. You didn't deserve that, Jason, and I hate myself for putting you through it. Her words were raw, filled with a vulnerability I hadn't expected. For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. I've been angry, I admitted, and hurt, and there were times I didn't think we could come back from this. Her eyes filled with tears, and she nodded. I know, but we're trying. I continued, my voice steady. And that means something. The boat rocked gently as we sat there, the silence between us no longer heavy but thoughtful. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, she said quietly. I just want you to know that I'm not giving up on us. I'm not either, I said, surprising myself with the realization. That evening, we cooked dinner together in the cabin's small kitchen. It was a simple meal, grilled chicken and vegetables, but it felt like the most intimate thing we'd done in months. We laughed as we navigated the cramped space, bumping into each other as we set the table. When we finally sat down to eat, I caught Sarah watching me, a small smile playing on her lips. What? I asked. Nothing, she said, shaking her head. I miss this. That night, as we sat by the fire, Sarah leaned her head on my shoulder. Thank you for coming here with me, she said softly. I didn't reply, but I rested my hand over hers, the smallest gesture of reassurance. For the first time, I felt like we were moving forward, not just patching up the cracks, but rebuilding something stronger, something worth fighting for. The drive back from the cabin was quiet, but not tense. Sarah sat beside me, gazing out the window as the trees blurred into a sea of green. Do you think the kids missed us? She asked, breaking the silence. I smiled faintly. They probably didn't even notice we were gone. They love spending time with your sister. Her soft laugh warmed the car. I hope so. I don't want them to feel anything's off. The unspoken truth lingered in the air. They didn't know what had happened between us. Not yet. When we got home, the kids greeted us with excitement, their voices tumbling over each other as they recounted their adventures with Sarah's sister. Emily proudly showed off a drawing she'd made of the family, a cheerful scene of us holding hands under a bright sun. I stared at it longer than I should have, the simplicity of it tugging at something deep inside me. That evening, after the kids were in bed, Sarah joined me in the living room. We need to talk about telling them, she said, her voice hesitant. I looked at her surprised. Do you think that's necessary? They're smart, Jason, she replied. They'll figure out something's wrong if we don't address it. And I don't want them to think we're hiding things. Her words made sense, but the idea of explaining everything to Emily and Tyler filled me with dread. What would we even say? I asked. The truth, she said simply, but in a way they can understand. They don't need all the details, just enough to know that we've been going through a hard time, but we're working on it. I nodded slowly, realizing that she was right. Okay, I said. We'll tell them tomorrow. The next day, we sat the kids down in the living room. Emily looked up at us with wide eyes, while Tyler clutched his favorite stuffed animal. What's wrong? Emily asked, her voice laced with concern. Sarah took a deep breath, glancing at me before speaking. Mommy and Daddy have been working through some problems, she said gently. But we want you to know that we love you both very much, and nothing will ever change that. Emily frowned, her brow furrowed. Are you getting divorced? The question hit like a punch to the gut. No, I said quickly. We're not getting divorced. We're just working on being better for each other. And for you. Tyler tilted his head, his small voice breaking the tension. Does this mean no more arguing? Sarah laughed softly, wiping a tear from her cheek. We're going to do our best, buddy. He nodded solemnly. Okay, can I go play now? Emily lingered for a moment, studying us with an intensity that reminded me of Sarah. Promise you're not getting divorced? She asked again. We promise, Sarah said, her voice steady. Emily nodded, satisfied, and went off to join her brother. That night, I lay awake in bed, replaying the conversation in my mind. It hadn't been easy, but it felt like a step in the right direction, acknowledging the cracks while reassuring the kids that the foundation was still strong. Beside me, Sarah stirred in her sleep, her breathing steady and calm. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe that we could make it through this together. After our conversation with the kids, a strange sense of calm settled over the house. It wasn't that everything was suddenly fine, far from it, but the weight of secrecy had been lifted. Emily and Tyler went back to their routines, their laughter echoing through the halls, while Sarah and I continued the slow, painstaking process of rebuilding what we'd lost. Therapy became our constant. Each session was like unearthing a buried landmine, emotions raw and volatile, threatening to explode if we didn't handle them carefully. Trust is like a vase, our therapist said during one session. When it's shattered, you can glue the pieces back together, but it will never look the same. That doesn't mean it can't still hold water. I thought about those words long after the session ended. Could our relationship hold water again? Sarah tried her best to prove it could. She deleted her social media accounts, as promised, and went above and beyond to be transparent, sharing her schedule, leaving her phone unlocked, and even volunteering to show me her emails and texts without being asked. At first, I didn't know how to feel about her gestures. They were necessary, but they also felt forced, like an apology written in actions instead of words. But over time, they started to feel genuine. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Sarah handed me her phone. "What's this for?" I asked, confused. "I want you to check," she said simply. "Anything you want, messages, calls, emails. I have nothing to hide." I hesitated, the phone heavy in my hand. "Sarah, I don't want to be the kind of person who has to check," I said finally. "And I don't want you to feel like you have to," she replied. "But if this helps us, even a little, then it's worth it." I handed the phone back to her without looking through it. "I'll take your word for it," I said, surprising myself. Her eyes shimmered with tears, and she smiled softly. "Thank you." The next few weeks felt lighter. We started spending more time together as a family, playing board games, going on hikes, and even planning a movie night with the kids. It wasn't always easy. There were moments when old wounds resurfaced, when a stray comment or glance reminded me of what had happened. But those moments were starting to fade, replaced by something more hopeful. One afternoon, Sarah surprised me by suggesting we tackle a long-forgotten project, repainting the bedroom. "It's time for a change," she said with a smile. We spent the day covered in paint, laughing as we argued over color choices and struggled to maneuver the ladder. By the time we finished, the walls were a calming shade of blue, and the room felt different. New. That night, as we lay in bed, Sarah turned to me, her voice hesitant. "Jason, do you think we're getting better?" I thought about her question for a long moment. "Yes," I said finally, "but we still have a long way to go." She nodded, her hand finding mine under the covers. "I'm okay with that, as long as we're trying." "We are," I said softly, and for the first time, I truly believed it. The repainted bedroom felt like a symbol of where we were, familiar but different, a foundation with cracks we were learning to live with. In the weeks that followed, Sarah and I began to find a rhythm again. It wasn't perfect, and some days were harder than others, but the progress was undeniable. Therapy had taught us to be honest, even when it hurt. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Sarah sat across from me at the dining table, her expression serious. "There's something I need to say," she began, her voice trembling slightly. I put down my coffee, bracing myself. "Okay, I've been thinking a lot about why I let Marcus back into my life," she said. "And it wasn't just about him. It was about me." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. "I felt like I was losing myself," she continued. "Like I wasn't enough. Not for you, not for the kids, not even for me. And instead of facing that, I ran away." Her confession hit me harder than I expected. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. She looked down, her hands twisting in her lap. "Because I didn't want to admit it to myself. And because I was afraid you'd think less of me." For a long moment, I didn't know what to say. "I never thought less of you," I said finally. "But I wish you'd trusted me enough to tell me. We could have faced it together." Her tears spilled over, and she nodded. "I know, and I hate that I didn't. I hate what I've done to us." I reached across the table, taking her hand in mine. "We can't change what happened," I said, "but we can decide what happens next." Her grip tightened, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of hope in her eyes. The next day, Sarah surprised me by organizing a family picnic at the park. It's been too long since we've done something like this, she said, her tone light but determined. Emily and Tyler were thrilled, helping us pack sandwiches and snacks before racing to the car. At the park, we spread out a blanket under a large oak tree, the kids running off to play while Sarah and I sat together, watching them. This feels nice, she said, leaning her head on my shoulder. It does, I agreed. For a moment, we sat in comfortable silence, the laughter of our children filling the air. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Emily ran over, holding a wildflower she'd picked. "This is for you, Mommy," she said, handing it to Sarah with a wide grin. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she took the flower, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, sweetheart." Tyler joined us, flopping onto the blanket with exaggerated exhaustion. "Can we do this every weekend?" I laughed, ruffling his hair. "We'll see, buddy." That night, as we put the kids to bed, Sarah stopped me in the hallway, her expression serious. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" "For not giving up on me," she replied. I hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you for not giving up on us." In that moment, I realized something I hadn't been able to admit before. We were stronger than I thought. As Sarah and I worked to rebuild, I found myself grappling with a truth I hadn't wanted to confront. Forgiveness isn't a singular event. It's a process, a constant choice to move forward, even when the past pulls at you like an anchor. One evening, during a quiet moment after dinner, Sarah handed me a journal. "What's this?" I asked, flipping through the blank pages. "I thought it might help if we wrote to each other," she said. "Things we're feeling or things we can't say out loud. It doesn't have to be every day, but I want to try." Her suggestion was unexpected, but it made sense. "Okay," I said. "Let's try it." That night, after Sarah went to bed, I opened the journal and stared at the first page for a long time. Finally, I wrote, "I don't know if I'll ever understand why you did what you did, but I'm trying to, and I'm trying to believe we can get through this." I left the journal on her nightstand and went to bed, not sure what to expect. The next morning, I found it back on my nightstand, a new entry written in Sarah's careful handwriting. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness yet, but I hope I can earn it. I'm grateful every day that you're still here." The journal became a quiet form of communication, a way to express things we struggled to say face to face. It didn't solve everything, but it helped. A few days later, during therapy, the topic of boundaries came up again. "Have you set clear expectations for moving forward?" the therapist asked. Sarah nodded. "We've talked about transparency, about making sure we communicate better." I added, "and about not avoiding hard conversations. That's what got us into trouble in the first place." The therapist smiled faintly. "It sounds like you're on the right track. But remember, it's okay to stumble. Progress isn't linear." Her words stuck with me. That weekend, Sarah suggested another family outing, this time to a small farm with a petting zoo and hay rides. The kids loved it, running from one animal to the next with unrestrained glee. Watching them, I felt a pang of guilt for the ways my anger and pain had affected them, even if they didn't fully understand what was happening. "Do you think they're okay?" I asked Sarah as we sat on a hay bale, watching Emily feed a goat while Tyler tried to chase a chicken. "I think they're resilient," she said, her voice thoughtful. "But I also think we need to keep showing them that we're okay, that we're a team." I nodded, her words resonating. "We will." That evening, after the kids were asleep, Sarah and I sat together on the couch, scrolling through the photos we'd taken that day. "This one's my favorite," she said, holding up a picture of Emily and Tyler laughing together. "Mine too," I admitted, smiling. She hesitated, then set her phone down and looked at me. "Jason, I know we still have a long way to go," she said softly, "but I'm starting to believe we can do this. Do you feel that too?" I thought about her question, about the journal entries, the therapy sessions, the moments of joy we'd shared despite the pain. "I think we're getting there," I said. "And that means something." She nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. "It means everything." For the first time in months, I felt like we weren't just surviving. We were healing. The morning light filtered through the curtains, waking me gently. I turned to find Sarah already up, standing by the window, with a cup of coffee in her hands. "Good morning," I said, sitting up. She turned, offering me a small smile. "Good morning." There was something peaceful about her demeanor, a quietness that hadn't been there in months. The kids burst into the room moments later, their laughter breaking the stillness. "Come on, Dad. Mom said we could go to the park today, Tyler said, tugging at my arm. Emily jumped onto the bed beside me. You promised you'd teach us how to fly kites. I chuckled, ruffling her hair. All right. Let me get dressed first. As the kids raced out of the room, Sarah lingered by the door, watching me. Thank you, she said softly. For what? I asked. For giving me a chance to be part of this again, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I didn't respond right away, but I nodded, letting her know I'd heard her. At the park, the kids ran ahead, their kites trailing behind them in the breeze. Sarah and I stood side by side, watching them. You're good with them, she said. So are you, I replied. She hesitated, then asked, do you think we'll ever get to a point where it doesn't hurt anymore? I thought about her question for a moment. I think the hurt will always be there, I said honestly. But I also think it'll fade. It already has a little. Her eyes shimmered with tears, but she nodded. I can live with that. That evening, as we sat at the dining table eating dinner, Emily looked up at us with a thoughtful expression. You and Mom laugh more now, she said. Sarah and I exchanged a glance, surprised. Is that a good thing? I asked, smiling. Emily nodded vigorously. Yeah, it makes me happy. Tyler chimed in, his mouth full of macaroni. Me too. After the kids were in bed, Sarah and I sat on the back porch, the cool night air brushing against our faces. I've been thinking about what you said earlier, she began, her voice hesitant. About the hurt fading. Yeah, I want to do everything I can to help it fade for both of us, she said, her voice trembling. I don't want to take this second chance for granted. Her words were raw, filled with a sincerity that stirred something deep within me. I know, I said quietly, and I want us to keep trying. The silence that followed wasn't heavy or awkward. It was comforting, a reminder that we didn't need to fill every moment with words. For the first time, I felt a sense of peace. Not because everything was fixed, but because we were both committed to building something stronger. As we sat there, watching the stars, I reached for Sarah's hand. She looked at me, her eyes wide with surprise, and then she smiled, a smile that held both hope and gratitude. We weren't perfect. We weren't even close, but we were trying, and for now that was enough.